Loving you was never about holding you tightly enough to keep you from changing. It was about trusting you enough to let you grow, because control is rooted in fear and love is rooted in patience. And the moment I understood that, everything shifted inside me. I realized that wanting to control someone is often a way of protecting ourselves from uncertainty, but loving you taught me to sit with uncertainty instead of fighting it, to allow space instead of building walls, to understand that people are not meant to be managed or directed, they are meant to be respected. Patience became the language of love when words failed, when answers didn't come quickly, when emotions needed time to settle. Loving you meant learning how to wait without resentment, how to pause without pressure, how to allow moments to unfold naturally instead of forcing outcomes because control demands immediate reassurance. But patience understands that real connection takes time, that trust cannot be rushed, that hearts open at their own pace. There were moments when I wanted to step in, to correct, to guide, to protect you from pain by steering your choices, but loving you meant resisting that urge. It meant believing in your ability to find your own way, even if that path included mistakes, even if it included lessons learned the hard way. Because growth does not come from being controlled, it comes from being trusted, and patience was the proof of that trust. I learned that control often disguises itself as care, but patience reveals true love because patience does not need dominance to feel secure. It does not need rules to feel respected. It does not need constant reassurance to feel valued. Loving you meant letting go of the need to be right, the need to be in charge, the need to shape you into something that felt comfortable to me, and instead choosing to accept who you were becoming, even when it challenged my expectations. Patience meant listening even when I disagreed. It meant staying present during silence instead of filling it with demands. It meant allowing emotions to pass without trying to fix them immediately, because not every feeling needs a solution. Sometimes it only needs space. Loving you taught me that giving space is not abandonment. It is an act of faith, faith that what is real will remain, faith that connection does not disappear just because control loosens. There were times when patience felt heavy, when waiting felt like weakness, when not intervening felt like neglect. But over time, I learned that patience is not passive. It is active restraint. It is strength that chooses calm over dominance, understanding over authority, love over fear. And every time I chose patience instead of control, the bond grew stronger, quieter, deeper. Loving you meant accepting that I could not dictate your healing, your timing, your journey. It meant understanding that love does not mean ownership, it means companionship. Walking beside someone without pulling them forward or holding them back, trusting that they will reach where they need to go in their own time. And patience was the bridge that allowed that trust to exist. The reason of loving you lived in those moments when I stepped back instead of stepping in, when I allowed you to struggle without making you feel alone, when I supported without suffocating, when I cared without commanding, because love that controls eventually breaks, but love that waits endures, and patience became the quiet promise that I would not try to shape you into something easier to love. I would learn how to love you as you were, as you changed, as you evolved, without fear, without force, without conditions. Patience taught me that love is not measured by how much you can influence someone, but by how safe they feel being themselves around you. And loving you became an exercise in humility, in releasing the illusion that I knew what was best for you at every moment, in accepting that your life was your own, your choices were yours to make, and my role was not to control the outcome, but to remain present through it. In choosing patience over control, love transformed from something fragile into something grounded, from something anxious into something steady, from something loud into something deeply rooted. And the reason of loving you grew stronger in the quiet moments, in the pauses, in the waiting, in the understanding that real love does not rush, it does not restrain, it does not dominate, it trusts, it allows, it stays, even when the path is unclear, even when timing feels uncertain, even when letting go feels harder than holding on. There was a time when love felt like something to win, something to chase, something that required proving worth through sacrifice, that left scars instead of growth. But real love does not arrive with demands. It arrives with understanding. And the reason of loving you was never about who you pretended to be for the world. It was always about who you were when no one was watching, when your guard was down, when your voice softened and your eyes carried stories you never learned how to tell. Loving you began the moment I stopped trying to fix you and started trying to understand you. Because understanding is where love learns how to breathe, and judgment is where it suffocates. I saw your mistakes not as failures, but as evidence that you tried, that you lived, that you stepped forward even when the ground was uncertain beneath your feet, that courage mattered more than perfection ever could. Loving you meant listening without preparing a response. It meant staying quiet long enough to hear what you were afraid to say. It meant seeing your anger as pain, asking to be acknowledged rather than something to fight against. The world teaches us to measure people by their achievements, by how strong they appear, by how little they break. But loving you taught me that strength often looks like survival, like getting up when no one claps, like ying wounds that never fully heal and still choosing kindness anyway. And that choice became the reason, because you did not let your suffering turn into cruelty. You did not let your past decide the limits of your heart. There were moments when loving you was not easy, when silence felt heavier than words, when distance crept in even while standing close, but love was never meant to be easy. It was meant to be honest, and honesty sometimes hurts more than lies because it forces us to see ourselves without filters. Loving you meant accepting that you would not always be whole, just as I would not always be strong, and that two imperfect people choosing patience over pride could create something real in a world full of performances. I learned that loving you was not about saving you, because love is not rescue, it is respect. It is walking beside someone without pulling them forward or holding them back. It is allowing them to fall and trusting their ability to rise. And every time you stood back up, even when your hands were shaking, even when hope felt thin, it reminded me why love rooted itself so deeply. Because resilience is quiet and powerful, and you carried it without asking for recognition. The reason of loving you lives in the way you kept your humanity intact despite the weight life placed on your shoulders, in the way you chose empathy in moments when bitterness would have been easier, in the way you looked at broken people and saw reflections rather than threats. Love. You became an act of learning, of unlearning everything the world taught about control, possession, and fear. It taught me that love does not demand perfection, it asks for presence. It does not shout, it stays, it does not rush, it waits, it does not own, it honors. There were days when loving you felt like standing in the rain without shelter, exposed and unsure, but even then it felt honest, because real love does not guarantee comfort, it guarantees truth. And truth has a way of reshaping you from the inside, stripping away illusions, leaving behind something raw and real. And that reality became the reason, because loving you made life less about pretending and more about becoming, less about winning and more about being, less about fear and more about faith. I loved you not because you were flawless, but because you were real, because you showed up as yourself even when it cost you, because you did not hide behind masks forever, because you allowed yourself to be seen. And that vulnerability carried more strength than any armor. Loving you became a commitment to growth, to patience, to understanding that people evolve at different speeds, and love is learning how to walk together without forcing the same pace. The reason of loving you is not a single moment. It is a collection of quiet choices, of staying present, of choosing compassion when frustration rises, of choosing understanding when assumptions try to take control. It is waking up and deciding again, even after disappointment, even after doubt, even after silence, because love that endures is not fueled by intensity, it is sustained by intention. And intention is built in moments no one else sees. Loving you taught me that love is not something you feel once and keep forever. It is something you practice, something you protect, something you return to when everything else feels uncertain. And the reason it remained was because it was never rooted in fantasy. It was rooted in truth, in shared humanity, in acceptance, in the quiet agreement to face life without turning away from each other, even when the path felt heavy, even when answers were unclear, even when the future asked questions we could not yet answer, because love, real love, is not about knowing everything. It is about choosing to stay open, choosing to understand, choosing to see the person in front of you not as they should be, but as they are, and finding that enough needs you to understand something before we begin. Love is not loud. It doesn't beg for attention, and it doesn't prove itself with words alone. Love is quiet strength. It's the reason you keep going when everything in you wants to stop. It's the reason you choose kindness in a world that often rewards cruelty. The reason for loving you isn't perfection. It's the flaws you carry and still stand tall with. It's the way you rise after being broken, the way you hold on to hope, even when life gives you every reason to let go. Loving you is not about possession. It's about belief. Belief that even in the darkest moments, you are worth choosing again and again. Today, this is not just about love for someone else. This is about the reason you must learn to love yourself. Because when you understand why you are worthy of love, nothing can take your power away. And once you realize that, everything changes. Staying is rarely celebrated, yet it is where love reveals its true weight. Because leaving is easy when things become uncomfortable, when misunderstandings grow, when disappointment settles in, but loving you meant choosing presence over escape, choosing commitment over convenience. Choosing to remain when walking away would have required far less courage, and in that choice, love found its depth. There were moments when staying felt like standing still while the world kept moving, when progress was slow, when clarity was absent, when doubt whispered that distance would be simpler, but love does not exist to make life simpler. It exists to make it meaningful, and meaning often demands endurance. Loving you required the strength to remain emotionally available even when the connection felt strained, even when answers were delayed, even when hope needed time to recover. Staying did not mean accepting harm or losing myself. It meant refusing to treat people as disposable, refusing to abandon something real at the first sign of difficulty. It meant believing that growth often comes through discomfort, that understanding deepens through conflict, handled with honesty, and loving you meant trusting that what we were building was worth the effort it demanded. There were nights when silence tested patience, when words felt insufficient, when exhaustion made distance tempting, but staying meant choosing dialogue over withdrawal, reflection over reaction. It meant recognizing that walking away can protect you from pain, but it can also protect you from growth. And loving you meant being willing to grow, even when growth felt heavy. I learned that staying is not about obligation, it is about intention. It is the quiet decision to keep showing up, to keep listening, to keep trying, even when emotions fluctuate, even when certainty fades. Staying is an act of faith. Faith that connection can evolve, that wounds can heal, that people can learn, and loving you became an ongoing choice rather than a momentary feeling. Staying meant facing imperfections without denial. It meant seeing flaws clearly and deciding not to turn away. It meant holding space for change without demanding it on my timeline. Loving you required patience that did not rush resolution, understanding that not every problem needs immediate closure. Some need time, consistency, and care. There were times when staying required silence, not as punishment, but as reflection, times when words needed to rest before they could be honest. Loving you meant knowing the difference between distance that protects and distance that harms, and choosing closeness, even when it felt vulnerable, even when it meant exposing uncertainty instead of hiding behind pride. The reason of loving you lived in the decision to remain present when things felt unresolved, to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, to believe that connection deepens when both people are willing to stay through uncertainty, because love that only exists in ease is fragile, but love that stays through difficulty becomes resilient. Staying taught me that love is not proven by intensity in the beginning, but by consistency over time, by who remains when novelty fades, when challenges arise, when life demands patience instead of passion. And loving you meant understanding that the most meaningful relationships are built not on perfect moments, but on imperfect ones endured together. In choosing to stay, love transformed into something steady, something grounded, something real. It became less about emotion and more about commitment, less about desire and more about devotion. And the reason of loving you continued to unfold in every moment where leaving was possible, but staying was chosen again and again. not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Pain has a way of revealing who we are when comfort is no longer available, and loving you meant learning how to carry pain without allowing it to harden my heart, because bitterness is a shortcut the soul takes when it refuses to process loss, disappointment, or unmet expectations. But love demands something slower, something heavier, something more honest. Loving you required the courage to feel pain fully without turning it into a weapon. There were moments when words cut deeper than intended, when actions left marks that apologies could not immediately erase. And loving you meant resisting the urge to keep score, to collect wounds as evidence, to let resentment become a shield. Because bitterness offers protection, but it also isolates. It builds walls where bridges are needed. Ego is loud, impatient, and fragile. And loving you required learning how to quiet it, because ego demands to be right, to be seen, to be protected at all costs. But love cannot grow in a space where pride refuses to bend. Loving you meant choosing humility over victory, connection over control, understanding over dominance. There were moments when ego wanted recognition, when it wanted apologies before understanding, when it wanted validation instead of resolution. But loving you meant letting those impulses pass. It meant realizing that being right often costs more than it gives, and that protecting ego can damage something far more valuable than pride. Silence became a form of strength when ego learned to step aside, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of listening, of allowing space for truth to emerge without interruption. Loving you taught me that not every moment needs defense, not every disagreement needs a winner. Some need patience, presence, and restraint. Ego resists vulnerability because vulnerability removes armor, but loving you required standing unguarded, admitting uncertainty, acknowledging mistakes without justification, because love deepens when honesty replaces image, when authenticity replaces performance, and ego has no role in that exchange. There were times when ego tried to turn pain into accusation, to frame misunderstandings as personal attacks, but loving you meant pausing before reacting, separating emotion from intention, choosing curiosity over assumption, because ego assumes, love asks, and that difference shaped everything. Loving you meant understanding that relationships are not battlefields, they are shared spaces, and ego turns shared spaces into territories, while love turns them into shelter. And every time ego softened, connection strengthened. Every time pride loosened its grip, trust found room to grow. The reason of loving you lived in moments where ego was quiet enough to allow compassion to speak, where defensiveness gave way to openness, where the need to be admired faded in favor of the need to understand. Because love does not require applause, it requires presence, and ego often stands in the way of that presence. When ego becomes silent, love becomes clear, communication becomes honest, intentions become visible, and loving you meant choosing that clarity over self-importance again and again, because love rooted in humility does not compete, it cooperates, it does not dominate, it connects, and in that connection, something real was allowed to exist. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, it removes guarantees and exposes fear. And loving you meant learning how to believe without needing certainty, because belief is not built on proof alone. It is built on trust, on consistency, on the quiet patterns that reveal who a person truly is over time. Loving you required faith that did not depend on perfect clarity. There were moments when the future felt undefined, when plans shifted, when answers remained out of reach. And loving you meant resisting the urge to demand assurance, to force timelines, to turn fear into pressure, because love that survives only with certainty is fragile, but love that learns to exist within uncertainty becomes resilient. Believing in you did not mean ignoring reality, it meant seeing your imperfections clearly and still trusting your intentions, trusting your effort, trusting your growth. Loving you required the patience to allow outcomes to unfold naturally rather than trying to control them through expectation. Uncertainty tested commitment, it challenged comfort, it exposed insecurities, but loving you meant standing steady while questions lingered, choosing presence over prediction, choosing connection over guarantees because life rarely offers certainty, and love that demands it will always remain anxious. There were times when belief felt risky, when doubt whispered louder than hope, but loving you meant understanding that belief is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision not to let doubt dominate. Behavior, it is choosing to act with integrity even when outcomes are unknown. The reason of loving you lived in the courage to stay open while the future remained unclear, to invest emotionally without absolute assurance, to trust that what was being built had value beyond immediate clarity. Because love rooted in belief does not collapse when certainty fades, it adapts, it strengthens, it continues. Loving you taught me that uncertainty is not the enemy of love. Fear is, and belief is the answer to that fear. Belief that honesty matters, that effort matters, that presence matters, and choosing to believe even without guarantees became the deepest reason of all.